There was a phrase floating around the last couple of years, quite annoying to me, but it comes to mind right now: speak truth to power. We're in the darkest days I've known in my life, no exaggeration. The most vital and pressing issue of our time is the subjugation of the population to onerous regulations which are supposed to prevent us from getting ill. For a year, the Canadian Constitution and Charter of Rights and Freedoms has been cancelled. Laws have been made across our country which would be illegal in ordinary times because it's not legal to make a law which cancels the Charter of Rights of the citizens and residents of Canada. And yet, here we are. Not only have such laws been created, but challenges to them in the courts are not possible because the courts are not functioning either. Parliament is not functioning. Just recently I saw a police officer arresting a journalist, and he was challenged that the law is not constitutional, but the officer was able to reply, that hasn't been determined in court yet. Very convenient. The people are oppressed and there is no recourse. In the midst of all this, yes, there is a virus you might catch. If you did possibly catch it, it might make you quite ill for a while. There's even a chance that it could kill you. But I remember how so many were killed for the sake of freedom in the first half of the last century. So many lives given to protect the very things that have been snatched away by governments in such a short amount of time. In the absence of any recourse, after all, politicians are not listening anymore, are they? They don't respond to serious and concerned inquiries from the electorate, and anything which does not fit the prescribed narrative is ignored or censored. So, in the absence of any recourse, any power remaining with the people, the politicians are elected to serve, with healthy Canadians who have committed no crime being hauled off to COVID prison without representation, with business owners in desperate straits, and some taking their own lives because they see no way forward, and with the majority of the population isolated. What should our response be? It seems that perhaps the only meaningful action left to those who want change is to call out the powers that be, to push back, to speak out against the tyranny. Enter the church, defender of the weak, breaker of chains, healer of the sick, voice for the downtrodden, releaser of captives. Except we are not being that in any way, are we? This is my strong objection, how Romans 13 is used to silence any pushback against an authoritarian and ungodly agenda. Sensible people, men of God, some of them famous leaders and prophetic voices, are stating that we should not speak against the government. We must submit. We must do as we are told because Romans 13. We're to be silent and not speak, submitted to the powers and authorities, they say. To strengthen the claim that we Christians have no voice against oppression and unrighteousness when we discern it, they point out the fact that Paul wrote this letter to the Romans, while imprisoned under the Emperor Nero. This is apparently to imply that he must have had Nero in mind when he wrote the passage. The conclusion we're supposed to accept, therefore, is that we should always obey all governments, even when they are evil, because God appointed them to do his will. It makes me wonder what the Christian response should have been to many other world-famous leaders: Genghis Khan, Mao Zedong, Lenin, Stalin, Pol Pot, Idi Amin, Kim Jong-un, Hitler, and his deputies. Apparently, we are to obey them because, quote, they are God's servants for our good. And don't forget, quote again, rulers are not to be feared by those who do good, but by those who do evil. Tell it to Corrie ten Boom, Watchman Nee, John the Baptist, Oskar Schindler, Nelson Mandela, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This doctrine of blind and passive subservience is ridiculous, if not heretical, in my opinion. Let me give you my take on how Romans 13 applies. Not all rulers are to be blindly obeyed. Not all are God's servants. Not all are working for your good if you're doing what is right. Not all are godly. Verse 1 of Romans 13 states that there is no power but that of God. Agreed, God is over all. His will and his nature would ideally be reflected in the leaders he has appointed, and the rulers referred to would be over the people of God, but under God. That's God's hierarchy using the image that is suggested by the text. But not all people have placed themselves under God. Nero was not under God in a leadership sense. He was an adversary of the living God and was not in place for the good of those who love the Lord. He tortured and killed Christians. Here's some background regarding Nero from Wikipedia. His infamous reign is usually associated with tyranny, extravagance, and debauchery. He was said to have seized Christians as scapegoats for the fire and burned them alive, seemingly motivated not by public justice, but by personal cruelty. I won't go into all the details of how brutally he persecuted the church. You can easily search online and get the gory and gruesome information about the deaths of the saints. The very act of becoming a Christian was illegal, and consequently having a church meeting was also illegal, yet the church continued to meet and prevailed. Romans 13 verse 4 states that the authority or power Paul speaks of in verse 1, exousia, is God's servant. This does not apply to many who have achieved power in our world. In fact, the word used in verse 4 in the Greek is diakonos, deacon. This is a church leadership position. And while the word is not exclusive to the faith, in secular terms the word refers to a servant or a waiter. This is not a word that would reasonably be used, referring to a despotic and ruthless dictator. It could be reasonably argued then that the whole passage is referring to church leaders, not secular authorities. The church is all over the map on the issue of standing up for basic human rights, which we thought were guaranteed. These rights are not unimportant. I believe that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada no longer has any value. If it can be cast aside so easily by a provincial or national legislature, and without any consequences, without any questioning or pushback in 2020 through 2021, it can be set aside again in the future when it's expedient for governments that want to act outside its limitations. One more thing. These freedoms we have taken for granted, freedom to travel and leave the country or come back into the country, freedom to not be arrested, to have legal representation, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, and freedom of religion, all of which no longer apply in Canada. These rights were not given to us by the government. All the government was able to do is take them away. Please don't give me the response, yes, but COVID, yes, but COVID. There are many responses, many different actions which could have been taken in answer to the threat of the virus and could still be implemented now. You can be sure that there is a different agenda being pursued under cover of COVID. We could have isolated the vulnerable, quarantined the sick, and more. Most of the rules that have been imposed do not have scientific credibility or even broad consensus from experts. Think curfew. Masks don't protect you, distancing won't save you, PCR tests are unreliable, lockdowns don't work. So where is the church, this faith-filled and spotless bride of Christ, the defender of the weak? The problem is not just that the rights we have lost so easily and readily are gone, but the opposite conditions are now the expectation. It's not just that we don't have a guarantee of freedom of religion anymore, for example, but now we're forbidden to practice our faith, our religion, if you like. This is from the tyranny of the new regime. Because of the power of technical censorship, our words, our arguments, our reasonable discussions and questions are cancelled, vanished into cyber ether. No dissension is allowed. In the midst of this civil oppression, we need a civil solution, a law-changing action which will restore our ability to meet as the church, offer salvation to all who would take it, and give the worship to God which He deserves. This is not just a human right, but a moral obligation to all who call on the name of the Lord. It's not reasonable to suggest, as I saw recently, That churches taking legal action using secular lawyers is somehow not right because the lawyers are secular. But then again, that secular Supreme Court judges deciding what church is or what church isn't somehow settles it. You cannot have it both ways. On the issue of secular lawyers, by the way, is there anything wrong with that from a Christian perspective? When you need a pipe fixed, you probably call a secular plumber. Chances are that most people are not trawling through church directories to find non-secular taxi drivers, hairstylists, appliance repair people, or computer programmers. The best person for a constitutional challenge to ungodly and unfair laws is a person who is a constitutional expert and has previous experience with constitutional challenges. However, it is not for secular judges to determine that because we have Zoom, that's enough, and therefore we have no constitutional claim. For me personally, Zoom church is not church at all. It's a shabby copy, a poor imitation of the real thing. It's counterfeit. The fact that people in many congregations are satisfied by it only suggests that they haven't been getting much better fare in their live and in-person church experience. Worship on Zoom is not the same as worship in the room. Prayer by a talking head on a screen is not the same as participating in prayer in person. Even in large congregations, this holds true. You can feel the power when the people of God are in one place and in one accord. Little wonder that the judiciary of the secular country is so willing to cut off your access. If a court determines what constitutes the practice of the Christian faith and the church in large part acquiesces, what happens to my own individual rights to freedom of religion? I disagree with the court. Do I personally have rights? We're not living in a theocracy, nor supposedly a dictatorship, but a parliamentary democracy, where individual rights and freedoms are supposed to be guaranteed in a charter that is higher than the laws created by governments. Our government system functions on adversarial principles. That's why we have Her Majesty's loyal opposition. And the charter begins with a declaration affirming the supremacy of God. Churches in other countries and at various times in history have disobeyed the government under persecution and continue to meet as the church, beginning with the church in the book of Acts, which was outlawed and persecuted. In China, although church was made illegal under communism, believers continued to hold meetings. Under threat of prison and dire consequences, they carried on. They didn't love their own lives enough to stop meeting together, even though the government had made it illegal. And the church grew in leaps and bounds. I heard long ago that the Chinese church prayed for persecution to come to the West, to bring us to our knees and to our senses so that we would grow. It's time now to grow up. I don't believe that most churches are growing in numbers under the present tyranny. A few may be doing reasonably well with the online services that are available, perhaps, but others have closed forever. One of the lasting effects of this shutdown is that many people will never return to church, if at some unknown point in the future that is made legal again. I have, though, heard stories of tremendous growth in congregations where the church is meeting in person even though it was outlawed. We are now the underground church in Canada. One thing is clear, on this as on so many other issues in our postmodern and enlightened times, the church response is all over the map. There is no uniformity, and in fact there is no unity. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. I believe the spiritual battle which now confronts us has three clear objectives. These are the intentions of Satan himself. 1. Usurp the Lord. 2. Keep as many people as possible from being saved. 3. Destroy the church. It is that simple. From that perspective, let's weigh the actions of our secular authorities and rise up as one, declaring, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God."